Hello friends. Welcome back to my channel. Let's start the first part of the new episode. Please like this. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung inward with a slow, echoing creak that instantly commanded attention. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pens froze above notepads. Reporters stopped whispering. Every head in the packed courtroom turned toward the entrance. Kody Brown stepped inside. She did not enter as a television personality, nor as one of the familiar faces from a reality show that millions had followed for years. She entered as a woman carrying decades of heartbreak, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Her posture was straight, her expression steady, and her eyes revealed something few had seen in her before, a quiet determination that refused to bend. At the defense table sat Kody Brown. Surrounded by attorneys and stacks of legal documents, he appeared calm at first glance. Yet anyone watching closely could see the tension hiding beneath his composed exterior. The confident smile that had so often appeared on camera seemed fragile today, wavering whenever his gaze drifted toward Kody. This was not another family meeting. This was not another reunion special. This was a courtroom. And for the first time in a very long time, every statement would be examined under oath. The judge adjusted his glasses and reviewed the thick case file resting before him. The folder was packed with documents, witness statements, correspondence, timelines, and evidence gathered over many years. The weight of those papers seemed to settle over the entire room. Kody moved toward her seat without looking at Kody. She wasn't interested in old arguments. She wasn't interested in reliving every disagreement. She was here because she believed certain truths had remained buried for too long. The gallery was packed with reporters, spectators, and curious observers. Some had traveled across the country to witness the proceedings. Others simply wanted answers to questions that had lingered for years. Behind Kody sat Robin. Unlike the confident image many associated with her, she appeared uneasy. Her hands rested tightly together in her lap. Every few moments she glanced toward the witness stand and then quickly looked away. Even before testimony began, the atmosphere felt charged. The judge called the session to order. The sound of the gavel cut through the silence. "Mrs. Brown," the judge said, looking toward Kody, "you may take the stand." Kody stood. The room seemed to hold its breath. As she approached the witness stand, memories flooded her mind. 25 years of marriage, countless family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, tears, sacrifices, moments she once believed would last forever. After being sworn in, she settled into the witness chair and folded her hands together. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Kody began. "I spent more than 25 years believing I was part of a family built on love, commitment, and equality," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, steady. "I believed every wife mattered equally. I believed every child mattered equally. I believed promises meant something." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge motioned for silence. Kody continued. "For many years, I convinced myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. I told myself things would improve. I told myself I was imagining the imbalance." She paused. "But eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore." Across the room, Kody shifted in his seat. His attorney scribbled notes. Kody opened a worn leather journal and carefully turned several pages. This journal contains entries written over more than a decade. The courtroom remained silent. "There were days I wrote because I felt invisible. Days I wrote because I felt unheard. Days I wrote because I needed somewhere to place feelings I couldn't express out loud." She looked down at the first entry. The date was years old. Reading slowly, she described moments when she felt excluded from family decisions. Times when important conversations happened without her knowledge. Occasions when she learned about plans only after they had already been finalized. As each memory emerged, the room grew quieter. What struck many observers wasn't anger. It was sadness. The sadness of someone describing a gradual loss. A slow fading. A feeling of being pushed farther and farther away from a life she had once helped build. The judge listened carefully. Several reporters wrote furiously. Even Kody appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Then Christine described moments involving her children. The atmosphere changed immediately. Her voice grew softer, more personal, more emotional. There were times my children needed their father, she said. And he wasn't there. No dramatic accusation followed. No shouting. No tears. Just a simple statement. One that landed with enormous weight. She described hospital visits, important milestones, family events, moments when her daughters had hoped their father would arrive, moments when they waited, and waited, and waited. Sometimes he came, sometimes he didn't. The emotional impact of those absences lingered long after the events themselves had passed. Christine spoke not only about disappointment, but about the difficult conversations that followed. Questions from children. Questions she couldn't answer. Questions no parent ever wants to hear. Why wasn't Dad here? Did I do something wrong? Does he love me? The courtroom remained silent. Even the reporters seemed reluctant to interrupt the gravity of the moment with the scratching of pens. Then Christine introduced additional documentation. Phone records, messages, family schedules, personal notes. Each piece, she explained, represented a small part of a much larger picture. One isolated event could be misunderstood. A pattern was harder to dismiss. The judge reviewed several exhibits carefully. Across the room, Kody's expression tightened. His attorney rose repeatedly with objections. Some were sustained. Many were not. The proceedings moved forward. Hour after hour. Story after story. Memory after memory. As the testimony continued, Christine emphasized something important. This isn't about revenge. The courtroom grew even quieter. It isn't about winning. She looked directly toward the judge. It's about finally being honest. Those words seemed to linger long after she spoke them. For years, much of the family's story had unfolded in front of television cameras. Millions had watched. Millions had formed opinions. Yet Christine argued that cameras often captured only fragments of reality. The private moments, the painful moments, the lonely moments. Those rarely made headlines. Now she intended to discuss them openly. The judge nodded for her to continue. Christine took a slow breath. Then she began describing how emotional distance can grow inside a family. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. One missed conversation. One broken promise. One disappointment at a time. Each individual moment may appear insignificant. Together they create something far larger. Something capable of changing relationships forever. As she spoke, many people in the gallery appeared visibly moved. Some nodded quietly. Others stared forward without blinking. A few looked down at their notes and stopped writing altogether. Because regardless of personal opinions about the family, the themes being discussed were universal. Feeling overlooked. Feeling unheard. Feeling unimportant. Those emotions transcended television and celebrity. They belonged to ordinary human experience. By midday, the courtroom atmosphere had transformed completely. The focus was no longer on fame. It was no longer on public perception. It was no longer on headlines. Instead, attention centered on the emotional realities being described under oath. When the judge finally called for a brief recess, the room erupted into hushed conversation. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. Legal teams gathered around tables. Observers exchanged stunned glances. Christine remained seated. For the first time all morning, she allowed herself to exhale. The strength she had displayed came at a cost. Reliving years of painful memories was exhausting. Yet she knew the proceedings were only beginning. Across the courtroom, Kody sat silently. His confident demeanor had faded considerably. He stared at the evidence spread across the defense table. Stacks of paper, printed messages, timelines, records, documents. Each one represented another piece of a story he would soon be required to answer. As spectators filtered toward the exits during the recess, Robin remained in her seat. For several moments, she simply stared ahead, lost in thought, caught somewhere between past and present, between loyalty and uncertainty, between questions and answers. When Christine eventually rose to leave the courtroom temporarily, their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Because in that moment, both women seemed to understand something the rest of the room was only beginning to grasp. The trial was no longer about old grievances. It was about truth. And truth, once spoken aloud, is difficult to silence again. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered beneath gray skies and exchanged predictions about what might happen next. Inside, legal teams prepared for the next phase of testimony. The afternoon session promised new witnesses, new evidence, new revelations, and perhaps most importantly, direct responses from Kody himself. The battle that had quietly simmered beneath the surface for years was finally unfolding in public view. And everyone sensed that the most consequential moments were still ahead. The afternoon session began beneath an atmosphere that felt heavier than before. The courtroom had refilled quickly after recess. Every seat in the gallery was occupied. Reporters lined the back wall with notebooks and tablets ready. Conversations were muted now. The excitement that had filled the hallways earlier had been replaced by anticipation. Everyone understood that the morning testimony had changed the direction of the proceedings. What had started as a dispute involving family relationships had evolved into something much deeper. The judge returned to the bench. The room stood. Then silence settled once more. Christine resumed her seat beside her attorney. Though exhaustion showed faintly in her eyes, there was no hesitation in her posture. She looked like someone who had spent years carrying an enormous burden and had finally decided to put it down in public. The judge reviewed several documents before speaking. "Counsel," he said, "you may continue." Christine's attorney rose. "Thank you, Your Honor." She gathered a stack of papers from her table. "We would now like to introduce additional evidence concerning family communications, decision-making practices, and patterns documented over multiple years." The attorney approached the witness stand and handed several exhibits to the court clerk. The screens positioned around the courtroom illuminated. Emails appeared. Text messages. Schedules. Meeting notes. Records that painted a detailed timeline stretching back years. The attorney turned toward Christine. "Mrs. Brown, can you explain the significance of these documents?" Christine nodded. Many of these communications involved important family decisions. "What kind of decisions?" "Housing, finances, travel, educational matters involving the children." The attorney paused. "Were you included in those discussions?" "Not always." The courtroom remained still. "What happened when you questioned being excluded?" Christine looked down briefly before answering. "I was usually told I was overreacting." The words hung in the air. The attorney continued carefully. "Can you explain how that affected you over time?" Christine took a slow breath. "It made me doubt myself." Her voice softened. "When enough people tell you that your feelings aren't valid, eventually you begin wondering whether they're right." Several jurors exchanged glances. The judge continued taking notes. Across the room, Kody remained motionless. His face revealed little, but his hands betrayed tension. They remained tightly clasped together. The questioning continued. Christine described situations where major family decisions had been finalized before she was even informed they were being discussed. Sometimes she learned through conversations with others. Sometimes through accidental comments. Sometimes after plans had already been set into motion. Each incident by itself appeared small. Together they revealed a recurring pattern. A pattern the court was now examining closely. As the testimony progressed, the focus shifted toward the children. The gallery grew noticeably quieter. Christine spoke about birthdays missed, important conversations postponed, promises delayed, and the emotional consequences that followed. She wasn't attempting to portray perfection. She acknowledged mistakes, her own shortcomings, moments she wished she could revisit. But she returned repeatedly to the same concern: consistency. Children, she argued, needed consistency more than explanations. They needed presence, reliability, trust. And when those things disappeared, emotional wounds often followed. The attorney introduced another exhibit, a collection of family calendars. Highlighted dates filled the pages. School events, medical appointments, graduations, celebrations, family gatherings. The records revealed attendance patterns that immediately attracted attention. The judge studied them carefully. Then he looked toward the defense table. Kody's attorney requested permission to review several documents more closely. Permission was granted. While the attorneys examined evidence, Christine sat quietly. For a moment, the courtroom observed a rare stillness. No questions. No objections. No dramatic exchanges. Just silence. The kind of silence that often follows difficult truths. Eventually, proceedings resumed. Christine's attorney approached again. Mrs. Brown, during these years, did you ever attempt to address your concerns directly? Many times. How? Private conversations. Family meetings. Counseling sessions. And the result? A faint sadness crossed Christine's face. Nothing changed. The answer seemed to echo. Nothing changed. Not immediately. Not eventually. Not after repeated attempts. The attorney nodded. No further questions at this time. The judge turned toward the defense. Cross-examination. Kody's attorney stood. Unlike Christine's lawyer, whose questions had been measured and methodical, his approach was more aggressive. Mrs. Brown, he began, would it be fair to say there were disagreements among all members of the family? Yes. And those disagreements were not solely caused by my client. Correct. The attorney nodded. So family conflict existed independent of Mr. Brown's actions. Christine remained composed. Conflict existed. That's different from responsibility. A murmur swept through the gallery. The attorney pressed forward. You acknowledge that managing multiple households presents unique challenges? Of course. You acknowledge it would be impossible for any individual to be present at every event? Yes. Then isn't it possible many of these issues resulted from logistics rather than neglect? For the first time, Christine leaned slightly forward. If a missed event happened once, I'd agree. The courtroom became still. But when the same pattern repeats for years, eventually it stops being logistics. No one spoke. Even the attorney paused. The answer had landed harder than expected. Cross-examination continued for nearly an hour. Questions became more pointed, more detailed, more confrontational. Yet Christine's responses remained remarkably consistent. She avoided exaggeration, avoided speculation, avoided personal attacks. Instead, she repeatedly returned to documented events and personal experiences. The judge appeared to take notice. By the end of the examination, the atmosphere had shifted again. The focus was no longer merely on whether mistakes had been made. The focus had become whether those mistakes formed a pattern significant enough to justify the claims being presented. As afternoon sunlight filtered through courthouse windows, the next witness was called. The courtroom buzzed with renewed curiosity. A former family counselor entered. The witness was sworn in. Questions began immediately. Without revealing confidential therapeutic details, the counselor described general observations from multiple family sessions. Communication difficulties, unresolved conflicts, power imbalances, emotional withdrawal. The testimony was careful, professional, measured. Yet its implications were difficult to ignore. The counselor explained how repeated invalidation can affect relationships, how individuals may gradually stop expressing concerns if they believe those concerns will be dismissed, how emotional isolation often develops slowly rather than suddenly. Several members of the gallery listened with intense focus. The concepts felt familiar, not just to this family, to countless families. When the counselor stepped down, another witness followed, then another. Each testimony added another piece to a puzzle years in the making. Some accounts supported Christine's perspective, others provided nuance. A few challenged portions of earlier testimony. But overall, a consistent theme emerged. Communication had broken down long before the public ever realized it. The judge eventually called for another short recess. This time, Kody remained seated after most people had stood. He appeared deep in thought. His attorneys spoke quietly around him. Papers moved across the table. Strategies were discussed. Arguments refined. Yet, even from a distance, it was clear that confidence had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, Christine stepped into the hallway. The crowds outside parted as she walked. Some reporters attempted questions. She declined politely. Others shouted requests for comments. She continued moving. Her focus remained fixed elsewhere. Not on cameras. Not on headlines. Not on public opinion. Inside the courtroom, preparations were already underway for the following day. Because tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Kody's direct testimony would continue. Tomorrow, additional evidence would be reviewed. Tomorrow, questions that had remained unanswered for years would finally be addressed under oath. As evening approached, courthouse employees began organizing files for the next session. Stacks of exhibits covered multiple tables. Thousands of pages. Years of history reduced to documents, transcripts, and evidence folders. Yet behind every page existed something impossible to fully capture. Human emotion. Regret. Disappointment. Hope. Pain. Love. Loss. The judge gathered his notes before concluding the day. His final remarks were brief, professional, measured, but they carried weight. This court's responsibility is not to determine public opinion. The room listened carefully. It is to determine facts. Silence followed. The judge continued. We will review all evidence fairly and thoroughly. With that, the gavel fell. The session ended. People slowly rose from their seats. Reporters rushed toward exits. Attorneys collected documents. Spectators exchanged theories and observations. Yet, as the crowd dispersed, one undeniable truth remained. The story was far from over. The evidence already presented had exposed deep fractures beneath the surface of a family once portrayed as united. And according to the witness lists still waiting to be called, even more testimony remained ahead. As Christine exited through the courthouse doors and disappeared into the fading evening light, she felt something unfamiliar. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Relief. Because regardless of what happened next, regardless of how the court ultimately ruled, the silence that had defined so many years had finally been broken. And once broken, it could never be restored. The next morning would bring new witnesses, new challenges, new revelations. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, the truth was no longer being carried by one person alone. It now belonged to the courtroom. And the courtroom was listening. The end. First part of the episode is over. Thanks for watching. Next part coming very soon.